Hey guys, today I want to talk to you about this book, Reader Come Home. This is one of my favorite books from 2023 so far, and I think it is one that absolutely you should read. But before we talk about this one, I actually have to mention this book, The Shallows. This is a book that came out in 2010, and I read it several years ago, but it is something kind of along the path that led me to Reader Come Home. This was the first book that ever just really clearly showed me how technology affects how the human brain functions and how we process stuff, how we think about stuff, and just how it literally goes in and rewires our brains. So this was one of my favorite books from the year that I read it. I think it was 2017, I want to say. But it was just one of my absolute favorites, and still, I recommend this book to everybody all the time. It's so, so great. So with that, I came across this book, Reader Come Home. This came out in 2018, I believe, and the reading brain in a digital world. I was like, sweet, yeah, let's do it. I want to find out about this. This book is basically an updated version of The Shallows, but focused on reading specifically. And the fascinating thing about this is that Maryanne talks about how reading is not something that's inherent in the human brain. Natural language is. And so if you take a kid and you just stick them with a group of normal adults, they will learn to speak whatever language that is just growing up without a whole lot of instruction. But no one learns to read just naturally. We all have to be taught how to read. And this was something that I never realized that I was questioning how this happened, but I grew up loving Westerns and loving Western stories and all this stuff. It always confused me how you could have somebody who, like, especially back in the Western days, where you would like make your mark, and it was like they knew how to just, draw an X or whatever. And they could speak fine and they could communicate, but they couldn't read. And that was always kind of like a discordant thought in my mind of like, how do you, like, I don't know, how do you know how to talk like a normal human being, but you don't know how to read? That seems really strange to me. And it's what she talks about in the very beginning of this book, is that reading is not a built-in mechanism in the brain. It's something that we develop, and it's not inherent in us. And so what she talks about is how we develop that mental ability, and how we maintain that mental ability is super important to who we are as human beings, really. So one of the key concepts that I took out of this book is something that she calls the digital chain hypothesis. And this is the idea that as we move from a literacy-based culture to a digital culture, how much we read has changed. And it's just an effect upon effect from there, where how much we read has changed, and that has changed how we go about reading, because we're reading very digital instead of physical, right? And that has changed what we read, the types of things that we're reading, and what we're able to consume. And that in turn is changing how things are being written, and that ultimately is changing why we're reading in the first place, which then circles back to changing how much we read. And what she really talks about with this is the idea, the comparison of deep reading versus shallow reading. And she references this idea from Aristotle about there being three phases of a good society. She takes that to also say that there's three phases of reading. And there's the one phase, which is just gathering information and gathering knowledge, acquiring knowledge. And then there's a second phase that's for entertainment and to be immersed and to be lost in a fantastical realm, right? And then there's a third phase, which is the reflective life, which is where we take everything that we gathered in the information gathering stage, and that we imagined, that we dreamed up in the entertainment and immersion stage, and we bring them all together and we synthesize them, and we use it to do something and create something and change something in our actual life. And that's the phase that the digital world doesn't leave enough time for, and that as we have grown in reading in a digital sense and in this digital world, we're slowly becoming less okay with the amount of time and the amount of effort that takes. So the more we read on these digital devices, and the more we read in things that are tailored to a digital world, the less ability we have to just sit down, still ourselves, and do the work of doing immersive reading that actually comes in and can change our life. And where the importance of this comes into play is when you go back to that understanding that reading is not something that is natural in the human brain. And so these neural pathways of deep thinking, which are what deep reading requires, are not in our brains by default. So when we engage in deep reading, we're building neural pathways that are helping us to have more empathy, and are helping us to do critical analysis, and are helping us to reflect on the things that we've learned. And all of these things are the skills that are required for deep thinking ergo good living. And if we don't develop them through deep reading, they're not going to naturally just appear out of nowhere. And that's where her concern comes in, is that we don't have anything else that we can point to that is nearly as effective at developing this critical analysis and reflection and empathy and all these skills that are required for deep thinking. There's nothing that can compare to the work of deep reading to develop those neural pathways. And if we don't develop those neural pathways, then they're not going to just show up. They're not just going to appear out of nowhere. And so Maryanne's concern is that as we're living in this digital world and as it's affecting us in ways that we don't even know and we're not even really aware of, either we're someone who has developed those neural pathways and we're slowly not practicing enough deep reading to maintain them, or we're a younger person growing up in these times and we're not even getting the foundation built of building these neural pathways in order to maintain them. And that was the biggest, just mind-blowing thing to me, is this idea of like, if you don't build these intentionally, they will not appear. And so when I look at people and see somebody that it seems like they're acting, they just have zero critical analysis ability and they can't think for themselves on anything, that legitimately is a thing, because they haven't practiced it, because those neural pathways don't exist by default. They have to be developed. And the only way to develop them is through the hard work of deep reading. And so this book just is a beautiful, beautiful case for how to take this understanding and move forward in a digital world. Maryanne is not a Luddite. She's not someone that's like, we can't, screw all the digital stuff. Her argument is to develop a biliterate brain. And what she means by that is where we have the ability to turn on the deep reading side of our brain and to engage in that third life, that reflective life of reading whenever we need to. But then we also have the ability to turn on the more digitalized version of our brain in order to consume and process and filter through the amount of information that's inherent in the information age that we live in. Otherwise, we would just be totally overloaded all the time. And so it's not a case of, oh my gosh, we have to dump all this in order to make use of what we used to be. It's we have to understand the advantages and what came with what used to be and figure out how to protect it moving forward, because as of right now, there is no other thing that we know of that has the same results, right? Deep reading is the only thing that we can truly point to say this is how we acquire the skills of deep thinking, because again, those neural pathways don't exist by default in your brain. One of my favorite quotes that I wanted to share with you guys actually came from someone else, from Steve Wasserman. He said, "Readers know in their bones something we forget at our peril, that without books, indeed without literacy, the good society vanishes and barbarism triumphs." And that quote hit me so hard with the state of things nowadays, and with looking and seeing people doing things that you sit back and you're like, what? How does that even make sense in your head? And you realize it doesn't have to make sense in their head, because they're not thinking about it at all, because they have no ability to do that. They either never developed it in the first place, or they have not practiced it in so long that it's just worn off and their edge has been dulled, and they have no ability to do critical thinking anymore because they're not willing to take the time to develop those neural pathways and practice that deep reading, ergo practicing that deep thinking. And so this book is unbelievably important. I think everybody should read it, especially if you consider yourself a reader. If you take pride in that thing of like, yes, like I am a reader and I want to be a good reader and I want to be a good citizen and I want to be a good person. I think this book is required reading for you. That's it. Reader Come Home, Maryanne Wolf. If you also want to, definitely grab The Shallows. These two are they're just so good. They're just so good. That's all you can say about them. They're just great. So, yeah. Hope you guys like that. Let me know if you have read either of these. Leave me a comment. Let me know if you want to read them. If you have any questions about them, leave me a comment. Let me know. I'd be happy to answer. And yeah, until next time, I'll see you guys later. Bye.